Hello and welcome back to another video on this channel. If you're new here, hey, hi, my name is Lillian and I like to talk about books. And today I thought I would talk about some of the classics that I would like to get to pretty soon here, as well as a bit of a take on the classics tag. I will leave the original questions in the doobly-doo below. I was inspired to do this when I came across Ariel Bassette's video talking about the next 5 classics that she is really excited to get to, so I thought I would do my own version of it. For reference, the majority of the classics that I like to read mainly come from the 20th century and the late 19th century. The first classic that I'll mention that I would really like to get to next year, hopefully maybe in January, is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. This came out originally in 1943 and is a coming-of-age story set at the turn of the 20th century following young Francie as she grows up in the impoverished neighborhood of Williamsburg in New York City, and is a coming-of-age story set at the turn of the 20th century. Next on the list is The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. This originally came out in the USSR in 1967 in a censored and serialized version that was being published by his widow in a newspaper in Moscow. This is widely considered a modern Russian classic, and it is a reflection on life in the Soviet Union in the 1930s under the Stalinist regime. It was being written between the years of 1928 and 1940, and Bulgakov decided that he didn't want it to be published until after he had passed, just knowing that it would be very controversial and would likely get him in a lot of trouble. So the original censored and serialized version of this came out in 1967, with the uncensored version being published and then translated into English in 1973. The story itself pertains to a visit from the devil in an officially atheist Soviet Union and the chaos that ensues. I'm really intrigued by the supernatural elements and the magical realism in this book, as well as the reported use of a lot of dark satire and critique. Modern Russian history is something that I'm quite interested in, and I remember this book itself being mentioned several times in some of the Russian history classes that I took for my undergrad degree, so I'm excited to finally be getting to it. The next book is slightly less well known, although apparently it is still a cult classic, and that is Against Nature, and I apologize, I'm going to probably butcher this author's name as he is French. This is by Joris Karl Huysmans, and it was originally published in 1884. Also, can we just have a minute for this cover, because it's so gorgeous. This is apparently a cult classic of deviance and decadence that inspired Oscar Wilde to write The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is one of my favorite classics that I have read. The main character is a nobleman that has become disgusted with bourgeois society, and so he decides to retreat to one of his family's villas to explore and lead a life of cultivation of the senses through art. After which proceeds, I'm sure, probably a decline into some level of debauchery, seeing that Oscar Wilde was inspired to write Dorian Gray. Seeing as Oscar Wilde was inspired to write Dorian Gray after reading this. But definitely excited to pick that one up and definitely do a comparison between my experience of having read Dorian Gray and its original inspiration. The fourth classic on this list is A Raisin in the Sun, which is written by Lorraine Hansberry and is a play that came out in 1959. When this came out in 1959, it was a pioneering work by a Black playwright that was a radical new representation of Black life in America during that time period. Reportedly, it's an unflinching look at what happens to people whose dreams are constantly being deferred. The play itself is a portrait of a Chicago family that is dealing with generational conflict amidst the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Rights Movement. And last but not least, I would really like to get to The Metamorphosis and Other Stories by Franz Kafka. This originally came out in 1915. I find it ironic that Kafka himself was virtually unknown during his lifetime, but now he is quite often seen as a hallmark of a modernist writer. The title story and many of his works deal with a modern sense of anxiety and alienation and loneliness in what feels like a very bizarre, hostile, and dehumanizing modern world. The Metamorphosis is described as, quote, a harrowing though absurdly comedic meditation on human feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and isolation. Personally, I think it'll be really interesting to read Kafka's work in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the widespread sense of isolation and loneliness that came with all of that. This will be my first Kafka. that I have ever read. Kafka is one of my partner's favorite authors, and I will definitely be excited to discuss this with him once I'm done reading it. So those are the top 5 classics that I would really like to get to as soon as possible, likely in the new year. Are there any classics at the top of your TBR list? Let me know in the comments. Next, I thought it would be fun to answer some of the questions from the classics tag. The original I will link in the show notes below, and if you're interested in doing it, I will tag you. Feel free to do it. First question is there an overhyped classic that I didn't really like? And the first one that comes to mind is Hamlet, which I read in my 11th grade English class and absolutely detested. I think there's something to be said about having a good English teacher that is able to really help their students engage with Shakespeare, because I think from the outside Shakespeare can be rather intimidating for people to read nowadays, even though in his own time he definitely was not seen as highbrow literature at all. But I've definitely had English teachers in my past that really were able to help get us engaged as students and get really into certain Shakespeare plays that might not otherwise have been interesting. Unfortunately, Hamlet was not one of them, and I think it was also in part because my English teacher that year was honestly rather pretentious and was constantly going on about how Hamlet was the greatest piece of literature ever written, and didn't really do much to help us as modern day readers connect with this character. And in all honesty, when I was reading the play and when I was watching adaptations of the play, I really despised it. I just thought that Hamlet was very whiny and annoying, if I'm completely honest. As far as Shakespeare's dramatic plays go, I much prefer Macbeth, and also the Patrick Stewart adaptation of Macbeth is chef's kiss. Would highly recommend. The second question is, what time period is your favorite to read about? And I'm guessing that this is as far as classics go rather than historical fiction. But as far as classics go, I really enjoy writings from the 1910s through the late 1920s, which I think is considered the modernist period. Just in general, as a history enthusiast, this is also a time period that I'm greatly interested in. I focused pretty heavily on World War I in the later part of my history degree, and a lot of that historical interest has overflowed into my literary interests as well. And a result of that, I think, is possibly unfortunately, but maybe not, I am very, very picky when it comes to historical fiction that features this time period, especially historical fiction that features World War I, which is a whole other discussion / side rant that I could definitely go down, and I might one day, but I think I'm gonna move on to the next question for now. Number 3, a book that you are embarrassed to have not read yet. I wouldn't necessarily say that I am embarrassed to not have read these books, but sometimes I get very surprised reactions when I tell people that I have not read some of these. The first of them being the majority of Jane Austen's works. I've read Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey, and that is it. This is something that I'm definitely looking to remedy in the coming years. I think also for me, as someone who really enjoyed Pride and Prejudice and really enjoyed Northanger Abbey, it's kind of hard to continue getting through all of Jane Austen's works, knowing that there's just a handful of them. But if you're a big Jane Austen fan, let me know which Jane Austen book I should read next after the 2 that I have read. And the other 2 books I'm going to mention are classics that I've had on my shelf for several years and have not gotten to yet. So in that sense, I'm a little bit embarrassed to not have read them yet. The first being The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. I've been meaning to get to Alexander Dumas for quite a long time. I know he's known for writing absolute tomes of books, but at the same time, the stories are reportedly still a lot of fun, still very engaging, despite being over 1,000 pages long in a lot of cases. And then the other classic that has been on my shelf for probably 8 or 9 years is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I've definitely enjoyed some Charles Dickens that I've read. I've also not enjoyed a Charles Dickens that I've read. Great Expectations. But A Tale of Two Cities has that very iconic opening line, and otherwise I don't really know very much about it other than it is set during the French Revolution. So I am still definitely looking forward to getting to this book at some point. Hopefully soon. Number 4, favorite movie or TV adaptation of a classic. A little bit of a confession here, I'm someone who adores period dramas, but the caveat being I have not seen a lot of the period drama adaptations of a lot of classic novels. For example, I've never seen any of the Jane Austen adaptation movies or miniseries, or the Bronte sisters. For me, I still very much have the mindset ingrained in me that I need to read the book before I watch the movie, which I know is not the case for a lot of people, but that is just how I like to operate generally. But I think the big exception to this is the Lord of the Rings movies. These are, probably my favorite movies of all time, or at least no, they're up there. They're up there. These movies are ones that I can just watch over and over and over again. And if you ask me which one is my favorite, it's always the last one that I've seen. While on the other hand, I've only read The Fellowship of the Ring out of that series. I would like to get to the entirety of the Lord of the Rings series at some point, but growing up I watched these before I read the books, and they still remain as some of my favorite movies of all time, if not my favorites. I also really loved the 1960 adaptation of Swiss Family Robinson by Disney. This is one that my sister and I would watch on repeat. Now, I haven't watched it in several years, probably since I was about 12 or 13, but it's one that I have very fond memories of having friends over for sleepovers, and we would watch it multiple times. And then I think later in middle school or high school I ended up reading the actual classic book, and still really enjoying that as well. And then last but not least, this one might be slightly bending the rules a little bit, but A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger is reportedly a very loose adaptation of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but that movie is just a lot of fun and I really enjoy it. Fifth question here is favorite editions you would like to collect more classics in. I tend to really enjoy the Everyman's Library editions. I just really enjoy the feel of them, and then also when you take off the dust jacket there is an absolutely gorgeous hardcover underneath. One of these editions that I have has lost the dust jacket, but it doesn't bother me at all because it is still absolutely gorgeous. So if I see those in a bookstore and it's a classic that I want to read, I will sometimes splurge on those, but I also really love finding them in used bookstores. Number 6, favorite modern book or series that is based off of a classic and or a fairy tale. The first one for me is definitely The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is a short story collection by her, full of retellings of fairy tales, and these fairy tales certainly do not shy away from the very gruesome aspects of the original tales themselves. Angela Carter's prose and composition is absolutely exquisite, and she is probably top tier for me when it comes to writers. The second book I'll mention for this category, let's see if I can get through the title without stumbling over the words, and that is The Girl Who Circumnavigated the Globe in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherynne M. Valente. I think I got that? No, I'm sorry, it's The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. But this is a middle grade retelling of the story of Alice in Wonderland, which is absolutely beautiful. I've only read the first book in this series because it is part of a series, but the first book itself is a very beautiful and eerie retelling of the story of Alice in Wonderland, and I would definitely like to reread it and continue on with the series. Catherynne M. Valente is also one of my favorite authors just because her prose and her compositions and her story ideas are gorgeous and very unique and oftentimes very eccentric. The last question on this list is an underhyped classic that you would recommend to everyone. One that I don't often see being talked about outside of a high school English class is Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. I think Arthur Miller might often more so be known for his play The Crucible, but this is also a play by Arthur Miller and very much deals with the death of the American dream, which is often a topic in literature that I'm very fond of. And I think that Death of a Salesman is just a very interesting look and depiction, or early depiction of that. Early in the sense of coming from the first half of the 20th century as opposed to modern day. The next book I would recommend to folks who are fans of Gothic literature, and I'm going to recommend The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. I think people often overlook this one, thinking that they know the ending, which you probably do, but nonetheless the way that this is written is just absolutely haunting. I think the ending, or the spoiler in this book, is very much a trope that is well known, but the way that Stevenson writes the last scene with the protagonist is just absolutely, like, I got shivers when I read it. The setting for the story itself is one that is in the foggy Victorian streets of London. There are a lot of scenes that take place at nighttime. There's a very mysterious atmosphere to it. So if you have not picked that one up, would highly recommend that one. And last but not least, for this category, I'm going to recommend another play, and that is The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. This is a play that, even reading it in the modern day, is absolutely hilarious. Oscar Wilde is very much known for his wit and sense of humor, tongue-in-cheek humor, and it very much shows in The Importance of Being Earnest. So if you are in the mood for a very lighthearted, tongue-in-cheek experience with a classic, go ahead and read that one. Alright, my friends, that is it from me today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. That apparently helps. Let me know if you've read any of these classics and what you thought of them in the comments. But I hope you all are doing well, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!